Tell me about Caldera 9, the Combine historian said. The human sitting across from her did not answer immediately. He was older than his service file suggested, or perhaps not older, but worn in a way that years alone could not account for. His hands rested on the table between them, palms down, and the historian noticed that they were the hands of someone who had spent a career touching things that other people considered broken. Calloused across the fingertips, scarred along the knuckles. Still. "What do you want to know?" Andric asked. The official record says 11 personnel held a monitoring outpost against a Drayen assault force of 300 for 9 standard days. The record lists you as a technical consultant, a combat engineer. But the after-action reports from the Combine Patrol that relieved the position describe a fortified compound with defensive infrastructure that did not exist in the outpost's original specifications. The historian's tentacles, she was Vekari, a cephalopod species from the same evolutionary branch as Torinvek's people, curled around a data tablet. They describe a wall. Andric looked at his hands. "Start from the night everything changed," the historian said. "The night you decided to go after the generator." He was quiet for a moment, then he began. "You are not," Specialist Andric said, "going to die in this room." The alien on the table did not respond, because the alien on the table had stopped responding 40 minutes ago. Liaison Officer Torinvek lay on a makeshift operating surface that had been, until 3 hours prior, the console desk of a Combine forward outpost secondary communications relay. His mottled gray skin had gone the color of wet chalk, and the 3 prehensile tentacles on his left side hung limp over the edge, their suction pads curled inward in what Andric had been told was the cephalopod equivalent of unconsciousness. The wound in his thorax was bad. Shrapnel from a breached conduit had punched through the flexible membrane between 2 of his body segments, and something dark and copper-smelling was pooling underneath him in a quantity that was not sustainable. Andric was not a medic. He was a combat engineer, a sapper by training, a fixer by inclination, and right now the only person in Outpost Caldera 9 with 2 functional hands and the willingness to use them. He pressed the folded section of thermal blanket harder against the wound and held it there, counting the seconds between pulses of fluid that seeped through the fabric. "You're going to make it," he said. Not because he believed it, but because he had learned a long time ago that speaking to the wounded kept his own hand steady. The words were tools, same as the multi-tool clipped to his belt or the detonation kit strapped to his thigh. You used what you had. Outside, something detonated, not close. Maybe 400 meters southeast, near the perimeter wall that Andric had spent 17 days reinforcing with scavenged hull plating, and a compound he had mixed himself from local calcium deposits and adhesive resin. The blast lit the room through the single observation port in a wash of orange that turned the walls amber and then faded. A second later, the concussion rattled the console desk and made the loose equipment on the shelves chatter against each other. Andric did not flinch. He had stopped flinching on day 3. The door behind him opened. Corporal Yenai, the outpost supply coordinator, stepped through carrying a field kit she had pulled from the wreckage of the Eastern Annex. Yenai was compact, dark-haired, and possessed of an economy of motion that Andric had found either reassuring or unnerving depending on the hour. Right now, it was reassuring. "Pulse. Weak, intermittent. I can feel it through the membrane wall, but it's getting harder to track." Yenai set the kit down and opened it with a snap. She was not a medic either. She was a logistics specialist who had spent the last 7 years managing supply chains across 4 different forward deployment zones, and had, in the process, absorbed enough field medicine to be dangerous in exactly the way that mattered. "Hemostatic compound. Already used what we had. This is the thermal blanket and pressure. That's it." "That's not it." She pulled a canister from the kit. It was Galactic Combine Standard Issue, a wound sealant designed for cephalopod physiology. The label was in the curling script of the Combine Medical Corps, and the canister was half empty, but it was the right compound. She must have found it in the Annex's emergency locker, buried under rubble that had been a ceiling 12 hours ago. Andric moved his hands aside. Yenai worked. The sealant hissed as it contacted the wound, expanding into a dense foam that found the torn edges of the membrane and bonded to them. Torinvek's body shuddered once, a deep, whole-body tremor that made his tentacles flex, and his chromatophores flash a rapid sequence of colors that Andric could not read. "Is that good?" Andric asked. "It means he felt it." "That's good enough for now." They sat in the half-light of the relay room and listened to the war outside. Outpost Caldera 9 occupied a mesa shelf on the border of Combine-controlled space, a spur of volcanic rock overlooking a valley that the Combine had considered strategically irrelevant until the Drayen decided it wasn't. The Drayen were a four-armed species from a cluster. The galactic charts labeled the Thresk Reach tall, double-jointed, covered in overlapping plates of amber-brown chitin that served as both exoskeleton and armor. They had 4 arms, each ending in 3 articulated digits, and they used all of them in combat with a coordination that looked choreographed, until you realized it was simply how their neurology worked. Every Drayen soldier was ambidextrous, in 4 directions simultaneously. They had arrived 9 days ago, not with a declaration of war, because the Drayen didn't issue those. They arrived with a forward assault element of 300 troops and a bombardment that cracked the eastern annex open like an egg. Caldera 9's original garrison had been 42. Combined regulars, mostly V3 avian scouts, a handful of Torinvek's cephalopod administrative officers, and a detachment of 5 humans who had been assigned as technical consultants under a bilateral cooperation treaty that the Combine had signed reluctantly, and Earth had signed with a polite smile that the Combine did not know how to read. 42. 9 days later, the number was 11. Andric knew all 11 by name. He knew their injuries, their ration status, their sleep cycles or lack thereof. He knew which of the 3 remaining V3 scouts could still fly on their damaged wings, and which one was grounding herself to keep pressure off a fractured keel bone. He knew that Torinvek had taken the shrapnel while sealing a breach in the communications array, trying to get a distress signal past the Drayen jamming net. He knew that Sergeant Noma, the outpost's ranking human and the closest thing they had to a commanding officer, was running on 4-hour sleep cycles broken into 40-minute intervals because she could not afford to be unconscious for longer. And he knew that the perimeter wall he had built was the only reason any of them were still alive. The wall had not been part of the outpost's original design. Caldera 9 had been built as a monitoring station, not a fortress. When the Drayen hit, the original perimeter had been a chain-link fence rated for weather and local fauna, and the original defenses had been a pair of automated sentry turrets that the Drayen's first bombardment had knocked out before anyone inside had finished their morning rations. Andric had built the wall on day 2, not because anyone ordered him to, because he looked at the terrain, looked at the materials available in the outpost supply annex, looked at the rubble from the annex itself, and saw a wall. That was what engineers did. They looked at what existed and saw what it could become. He had used hull plating from the damaged supply shuttles that would never fly again. He had used the calcium compound adhesive he had formulated from local geological deposits, a trick he had learned at the Ridgeway Engineering School on a Tuesday afternoon from a professor who had been teaching materials science for 37 years, and had said, once, that the difference between a good engineer and a dead engineer was the willingness to build with what was ugly. He had used the automated construction module from the outpost's maintenance bay, reprogramming its fabrication protocols to cut plating to the dimensions he needed, instead of the standard repair templates it was designed for. Yenai had supplied the logistics. She had inventoried every piece of salvageable material in the outpost in 6 hours flat, assigned weight and structural ratings from memory, and delivered a manifest that told Andric exactly what he had to work with. No waste, no guesswork, a map of every resource on the mesa. Sergeant Noma had supplied the tactical framework. She had walked the perimeter with Andric on the morning of day 2, not telling him where to build, but telling him where the attacks would come from and how the Drayen would mass their forces. She did this with the quiet precision of someone who had studied enough alien tactical doctrine to think in their patterns. When Andric asked her how she knew where the next push would hit, she said, "They're systematic. 4 arms, 4 approach vectors. Rotate the emphasis and you map it." She was right every time. The wall had held. 9 days, 14 assaults, and the wall had held. Not because it was beautiful. It was an ugly thing, a patchwork of scorched hull plating and calcium compound and repurposed structural beams, standing 3 meters high in some places and barely 2 in others, with gun ports that Andric had cut with a plasma torch and sight lines that Noma had marked with adhesive strips she pulled from the medical supplies. It held because it was built by people who understood what they were building for. Another detonation, closer this time. Andric felt it through the floor, a bass register vibration that traveled up through his knees and settled behind his sternum. He looked at Yenai. She looked back. "That's the southeast section," she said. "I know. That's your patch job from yesterday." "I know. How many more hits can it take?" Andric considered the question the way he considered all structural questions, with his hands first, his mind second. He had reinforced the southeast section after a Drayen Sapper team had breached it with a shaped charge on day 7. The repair had used the last of the hull plating from the No. 2 shuttle, and a crossbrace fabricated from the communications mast that Torrenvec had already given up trying to use. The compound had cured for 16 hours before the next assault. Not ideal. 24 would have been better, 36 would have been right. 2, he said. Maybe 3 if the angle of impact stays oblique. If they hit its center mass with a directed charge, 1. Yenai nodded. She did not argue, did not ask for a better answer, did not suggest alternatives. She catalogued the information the way she catalogued everything, cleanly, without sentiment, and moved on. "Noma wants you on the wall in 20 minutes. She's pulling the V3 scouts in for rest rotation." "I'm not a gunner." "You're a warm body with hands that work. That's a gunner." Andric looked down at Torrenvec. The cephalopod's skin had shifted from wet chalk to something closer to its natural mottled gray, and the chromatophores along his mantle were cycling through slow, regular patterns instead of the erratic flashing from before. The sealant was holding. The bleeding had stopped, or at least slowed to something the body could manage. "He needs someone here." "I'll stay." Yenai pulled a stool from under the console desk and sat down, placing 2 fingers against the membrane where she could monitor the pulse. "Go. If the wall comes down, none of this matters." Andric went. The mesa at night was a different world from the mesa during the day. The Drayen preferred night assaults. Their visual processing operated on a broader spectrum than human eyes, and they used the dark the way a swimmer used water, moving through it with native comfort. The Combine garrison's night vision equipment was serviceable but limited, and the humans on the wall relied as much on sound and vibration as sight. Andric had rigged motion sensors along the approaches, using components salvaged from the sentry turrets, but the Drayen had figured out 2 of the 3 frequencies, and were jamming them intermittently. He climbed the makeshift stairs, welded metal treads, bolted to the wall's inner face, and reached the firing step. Sergeant Noma was there, crouched behind the parapet with a kinetic rifle braced against the calcium compound and her eyes on the dark valley below. "Andric." "Sergeant." "Southeast section. 2 impacts in the last hour, both from the 280-degree approach. They're probing." "Probing or ranging?" Noma's mouth thinned. "Ranging. They'll hit us again before dawn. The pattern says 300 to 330. Andric checked his watch. 22:14, less than 5 hours. The section will hold 2 more oblique impacts, 1 center mass. I need it to hold 4. Then I need material. There is no material, Andric. We've used everything. He leaned against the parapet and looked out over the dark. The valley below was a basin of volcanic rock, flat and featureless under the starlight, dotted with the wreckage of previous assaults, burned-out Drayen vehicles, scattered equipment, a few shapes that were bodies and that Andric had stopped looking at individually around day 5. The Drayen lines were invisible, but he could feel them out there the way you could feel weather coming. A pressure, a density in the dark. The floor, he said. What? The relay room floor. It's composite decking, 80-centimeter panels, load-rated for equipment. If I pull 6 panels and cut them to reinforce the breach points, the section holds. That's the floor of the room where Torenvek is lying. I'll move him first. Noma looked at him for a long time. In the starlight, her face was all planes and angles, the weariness so deep it had become a geological feature, something that had always been there and always would be. She was 41 years old and looked 60, and moved like someone who had decided that aging was a logistical problem she would deal with later. Do it, she said, and Andric. Yeah. V3 Scout Keswick took a beam graze on her port wing. She's in the northern annex. She says she can fly. She can't. Make sure she doesn't try. That's not engineering. No. That's being the person she trusts enough to listen to. Andric looked at her. Since when does she trust me? Since you crawled out to the perimeter on day 4 to fix the sensor array she uses for approach warnings, in the middle of a bombardment, because she asked you to, and you didn't ask why. He remembered. He hadn't thought of it as a trust-building exercise. He had thought of it as a repair that needed doing, and Keswick had needed the array, and the bombardment was something that was happening while the repair happened. That was how engineers thought. The problem was the job. Everything else was context. He climbed down from the wall and crossed the compound to the northern annex. Keswick was sitting on a supply crate, her long legs folded beneath her in the way V3 rested when they couldn't roost, her narrow avian face tilted toward the ventilation port where a draft of night air came through. Her wings were folded against her back, but the left one sat wrong too high, the leading edge swollen where the beam had grazed the flight membrane. Even in the low light, Andric could see the discoloration, a dark streak against the iridescent blue-green of her plumage. Keswick. She turned her head. V3 eyes were large, forward-facing, and adapted for aerial hunting, and in the dark they reflected the faintest light with a faint amber glow. She regarded him with the alert stillness of a raptor. Engineer Andric. How's the wing? Functional. No, it isn't. She made a sound, a low, whistling exhale through her beak that the translator in Andric's earpiece did not bother to render, because it was not language. It was frustration, and it was the same in every species he had ever worked with. I can fly, she said. You can launch. You probably can't sustain. And if you stall on a damaged membrane at altitude over a valley full of Drayen who shoot at anything airborne, you don't come back. That's not courage, Keswick. That's subtraction. I'm already running out of people I trust to watch the approaches. She looked at him for a long moment. Andric held the gaze, not because he was challenging her. V3 were not a species that interpreted eye contact as dominance, but because he had learned that Keswick read sincerity from duration. The longer you looked, the more she believed you meant it. You trust my watch, she said. I built a sensor array in a bombardment because you needed it. What does that tell you? She settled her wings. The injured one adjusted, and she winced a sharp flexion of the nictitating membranes over her eyes that served the same function as a human flinch. She was in pain. She did not want to be in pain on the ground. Every instinct in her species said that pain on the ground meant death, because on the ground you could not fly, and if you could not fly, you could not escape. "Stay on the crate," Andric said. "Monitor the northern approach from the observation port. If you see movement, flag Noma on the short channel. That's more valuable than one damaged wing pass over the valley." She considered. Then she nodded a quick, bird-like dip of her head. "I will watch," she said, "but engineer Andric." "Yeah. If the wall falls and they breach, I am going up, damaged wing or not. If the wall falls, I'll go up with you. We'll figure out the physics on the way." She made another sound. This one the translator caught, a soft, clicking vocalization that in V3 culture was reserved for close-bonded flock members. It meant something between acknowledgement and affection, and Andric had heard it directed at him exactly twice before, once after he fixed the sensor array, and once after he had carried a wounded V3 scout named Pellies from the Eastern Annex to the medical station on his back, through a corridor that was actively collapsing, because Pellies was too injured to walk and too large for any of the other V3 to carry without flight. Pellies had not made it. The internal injuries were too severe, and the combined medical supplies were not designed for the specific hemorrhage pattern that V3 physiology produced under that kind of trauma. Andric had stayed with him for the last hour, and when it was over, he had closed Pellies' nictitating membranes himself, because the other V3 were crying in the way their species cried, silent, rigid, their feathers clamped flat, and someone had to do the physical thing. Andric was the physical thing person. That was what engineers were. He went back to the relay room. Yenai was still there, 2 fingers on Torinvek's membrane, reading pulse. "Better," she said. "Rhythm stabilizing. He might regain consciousness in a few hours." "Good, because I need the floor." She looked at him. He explained. She listened, cataloged, and had a logistics answer before he finished. "I can get you 8 panels, not 6. The section under the console bank isn't load-bearing for the equipment anymore since we stripped the hardware. I can pull those too, but I need 30 minutes and a pry bar." "I have a pry bar." "I know. It's on your belt next to the detonation kit. I inventoried your person on day 1. "You inventoried me." "I inventoried everything in this outpost. You're in the outpost." Andric could not argue with the logic. He moved Torinvek to the corridor on a stretcher made from a cargo net and 2 structural poles, settling the cephalopod against the wall with the blanket tucked around his body segments. Torinvek's chromatophores pulsed slowly, deep blues and greens, which Andric had been told were the cephalopod equivalent of deep sleep. Restful, not dying. There was a difference, and after 9 days, Andric had learned to read it. He and Yenai pulled the floor panels. It took 40 minutes, not 30, because 2 of the panels had bonded to the subfloor with a combination of age and leaked hydraulic fluid, and Andric had to use the plasma torch to cut them free without warping the composite. Yenai held the panels steady while he cut, her small hands braced against the material with a grip strength that he had stopped being surprised by around day 6. 8 panels, each one roughly 80 centimeters square and 4 centimeters thick, rated for 2,000 kilograms of static load. Not hull plating, not ideal. But composite decking had a flex tolerance that hull plating lacked, and flex tolerance was what the southeast section needed, the ability to absorb impact energy through deformation rather than fracture. "This might actually work better than the hull plating," Andric said, examining a panel under the work light. "I know," Yenai said. "I did the comparative load analysis while you were on the wall. The flex modulus on this composite is 18% higher than the shuttle plating you used on day 7. He looked at her. "You run load analyses in your head." "I run inventory analyses. Load analysis is inventory with physics attached." They carried the panels to the southeast section. Andric worked by headlamp, bolting the composite panels over the breach points using fasteners he had fabricated from the sentry turret mounting brackets. The calcium adhesive went down thick between panel and wall, filling gaps, bonding surfaces. He worked with the focused precision that combat engineers learned in training and refined under fire, every motion purposeful, every fastener seated, every bead of adhesive placed where structural modeling said it would do the most good. Yenai handed him tools before he asked for them. She had watched him work for 9 days and had mapped his process the way she mapped supply chains, identifying patterns, anticipating needs, pre-staging resources. When he reached back for the torque driver, it was already in her hand. When he needed the adhesive applicator recharged, she had already prepped it. They did not talk while they worked. They did not need to. At 1:14, Andric tightened the last fastener and stepped back. The southeast section looked worse than it had before, a patchwork of hull plating, composite decking, structural beams, and calcium adhesive that resembled nothing so much as a wound that had been sutured by someone who cared more about function than aesthetics. But the structural integrity readings on the portable scanner were solid, better than solid. The composite panels distributed load across a wider footprint than the hull plating alone, and the adhesive bonds had cured faster than expected in the cool night air. 4 impacts, Andric said. Center mass. Maybe 5. Yenai ran her own numbers. 4 confirmed. 5 if the adhesive gets another 90 minutes of cure time. Tell Noma. Already did. She adjusted the defensive rotation to cover the 300 window. Andric walked the full perimeter before he let himself sit. He did this every night after a repair, a slow circuit of the wall's inner face, one hand trailing along the surface, reading the structure through his fingertips the way a doctor read a pulse. Every seam, every bolt, every bead of adhesive told him something. Here, the compound was curing well solid, slightly warm to the touch from the exothermic reaction. Here, a hairline fracture was propagating along a stress line he had flagged on day 5 and patched on day 6. Here, the northern section's foundation was shifting imperceptibly on the volcanic substrate, a millimeter of lateral drift that would become a problem in another 48 hours if the substrate kept cooling at the rate the mesa's thermal gradient suggested. He noted it. He cataloged it. He filed it alongside the 100 other structural observations he carried in his head, the living map of a wall that was not a wall but a breathing, aging, stressed organism that required constant attention to survive. On the eastern section he paused. Private Hodgen was on watch here, sitting with his back against the parapet, his rifle across his knees, his eyes on the dark. Hodgen was 26, from a farming district on Mars Colony 7, and he had the large, quiet hands of someone who had grown up repairing irrigation systems and grain processors. He was not a combat soldier by training or temperament. He was a technical aide who had been assigned to Caldera 9 because his skill set included electrical systems maintenance, and the outpost's power grid needed regular attention. 9 days had turned him into something else. Not a warrior. Hodgen would never be comfortable with that word, but something functional, something that stood on a wall in the dark and watched. Anything? Andric asked. Movement at the 60 mark, about 600 meters. Patrol pattern, 2, maybe 3. Same as last night. Same spacing, different timing. They shifted the rotation by about 40 minutes. Andric filed that. How are you on ammunition? 14 rounds in the magazine. 2 spares. Yenai said there's a partial crate in the western storage bay, but half the rounds are V3 caliber and don't fit our rifles. I can machine adapters. Hodgen looked at him. You can machine ammunition adapters. I can machine anything that has a shape. It's just metal and tolerances. You're a strange person, Andric. I'm an engineer, same thing. Hodgen almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that happened on day 9 of a siege, a ghost of expression that lived in the muscles around the eyes and never quite reached the mouth. It was enough. At 2:47, the Drayen hit them. It was not a probe. It was a full assault, 3 approach vectors simultaneously, which was new. The Drayen had been rotating their attack axis on each assault, hitting from a single direction with concentrated force. 3 vectors meant they had brought up reserves. 3 vectors meant they were done probing. Andric was on the wall when it started. The first rounds hit the eastern section, kinetic impacts that shook the parapet and sent chips of calcium compound flying. He felt the wall shudder under his feet and read the vibration the way a pilot read turbulence through his body, through his bones, through the part of his nervous system that had rewired itself over 9 days to interpret structural stress as physical sensation. The southeast section took the second wave. 2 directed charges detonated against the reinforced panels within 6 seconds of each other, and Andric watched from 20 meters down the wall as the composite flexed inward, absorbed the energy, and held. The adhesive cracked in a spiderweb pattern along the surface, but the bond integrity held. The panels bowed but did not break. The third vector was the west wall, and that was where the breach came. Andric heard it before he saw it, a sound like a ship hull tearing, metallic and enormous, followed by the flat crack of the calcium compound failing along a seam he had known was weak since day 4, but had not had the material to reinforce. A 3-meter section of the western wall folded inward, and the first Drayen came through before the dust settled. They were fast. 4 arms, each one articulated at 3 joints, moving in independent coordination as they clambered through the breach. Their amber-brown chitin caught the starlight in dull gleams, and their forward eyes, too large, too small, arranged in a diamond pattern, swept the compound interior with the systematic efficiency of a species that hunted in coordinated squads. Andric was already moving, not toward the breached Noma, and 2 of the remaining garrison had that covered, their kinetic rifles cracking in the flat, rhythmic cadence of disciplined fire. He was moving toward the structural failure point, because his mind had already mapped the damage and calculated what the wall needed to hold while the breach was contested. He ran along the inner base of the wall, pulling the emergency repair kit from the staging point where Yenna had prepositioned it 12 hours ago. 2 hull plate offcuts, 4 structural bolts, the adhesive applicator. Not enough for a permanent repair. Enough for a patch that would hold until the assault was over, if the assault was over in the next 20 minutes. A Drayen soldier came through a gap in the rubble 15 meters ahead of him. 4 arms, a blade in each of the upper 2, the lower 2 braced against the wall for leverage. Its eyes locked onto Andric, and it launched itself forward in the coiled, multi-limbed sprint that made the Drayen terrifying in close quarters. Andric did not run, he did not shout. He set the repair kit down, pulled the detonation charge from his thigh pouch, a shaped demolition charge designed for breaching reinforced structures, not anti-personnel use, but physics was physics, and thumbed the proximity fuse to contact detonation. He placed it on the ground between himself and the charging Drayen, stepped back 2 meters and dropped flat. The Drayen stepped on it. The detonation was sharp, directed upward by the shape charge design, and the Drayen went up and then down and then did not get up. Andric rose, recovered the repair kit and continued to the breach point. His ears were ringing. His hands were not shaking. An engineer's hands did not shake when there was a repair to make. He worked the patch while the fighting continued around him. Noma's rifle cracked in steady pairs. A V3 Scout, not Keswick, the other one, Murren swooped past overhead in a strafing run that scattered a Drayen squad reforming near the breach, her wing-mounted flares leaving streaks of white light across the dark sky. Andric heard the 4-armed soldiers shouting to each other in their clicking, percussive language, and the translator in his ear caught fragments. Fortified, unexpected, the wall builder. The wall builder. They had a name for him. He finished the patch. The hull plate offcuts went over the structural failure point, bolted and adhesed in a configuration that was ugly and functional, and would hold for exactly as long as it needed to hold. He ran a hand along the seam, feeling the bond, reading the material through his fingertips the way he always did, the language of stress and flex, and load that no scanner could teach you because it lived in the hands, in the years of touching broken things and making them whole. The assault broke at 3:31. The Drayen pulled back, dragging their wounded, leaving their dead. Andric counted 4 Drayen bodies inside the compound. On their side, Murren had taken a kinetic round through the trailing edge of her right wing and was grounded, functional, but not flying for at least 2 days. Private Hodgen had a deep laceration on his forearm from a Drayen blade that Yenai was already cleaning and closing when Andric came down from the wall. 11 people, still 11. Andric walked the compound after the assault, cataloging damage the way he cataloged everything systematically, without emotional markup, each observation a data point in the ongoing structural analysis that his brain ran whether he wanted it to or not. The western breach repair was holding but stressed. The eastern section had lost a layer of calcium compound along the lower third, cosmetic, not structural, but it would need attention before the next impact. The northern wall, which had not been hit tonight, had a new crack propagating from a bolt hole that had been drilled at a slightly wrong angle on day 3, when Andric's hands had been shaking from exhaustion, and he had not yet learned to compensate. He noted that crack. He would fix it at dawn. He would fix everything at dawn because that was what the hours between assaults were for, not rest, not recovery, but repair. The wall lived in the intervals. Without them, it died. In the medical station, Yenai was finishing the sutures on Hodgen's forearm while the V3 scout Murren sat with her damaged wing extended, examining the hole in the trailing edge with a methodical attention that reminded Andric of the way he examined stress fractures. She was mapping the damage, he realized, reading the wound the way a pilot read a flight surface, calculating what she had lost and what she could still do with what remained. She caught him watching. Her amber eyes held his for a beat, and then she folded the wing carefully, testing its range, feeling for the limitations. She did not say anything. She did not need to. They were past the part of the siege where people needed words to communicate the basic facts. Andric sat on the ground against the inner face of the wall he had built, and he let himself be tired for 30 seconds. He counted them. 1, 2, 3. At 30, he stood up. Yenai was beside him. She handed him a ration bar. He ate it. It tasted like compressed grain and nutrient paste and nothing at all, and it was the best thing he had eaten in 9 days because she had handed it to him. "Torenvek is awake," she said. Andric looked at her. "He's conscious. He asked for you by name." They crossed the compound together. In the corridor outside the stripped relay room, Torenvek was propped against the wall, his mottled gray skin cycling through pale greens and blues that Andric had come to associate with alertness. 3 of his 6 tentacles were moving independently, testing the floor, the wall, the blanket. His eyes large, dark, with horizontal pupils that dilated in segments focused on Andric as he approached. "Engineer Andric." The voice came through the translator with a slight buzz, the artifact of converting a vocalization system that relied on water resonance through a pharyngeal chamber into something a human ear could parse. "I am told you kept me alive." "Yenai kept you alive. I held a blanket on you." "I am told you held it for 40 minutes without moving your hands." "It was a repair. I hold things still until they're fixed. That's my job." Torenvek's chromatophores shifted a slow, deliberate pattern that Andric recognized from the cultural briefing he had read on the transport ship 11 weeks ago, a lifetime ago, a universe ago. The pattern meant something close to gratitude, but with a weight that the human word did not carry. In cephalopod culture, it was the recognition of a debt that could not be repaid through material exchange, because the currency involved was time, the time the debtor would not have had without the creditor's action. It was the most serious expression of obligation their species possessed. "Don't," Andric said. Torenvek paused. The pattern held. You don't owe me anything, Torrenvek. You got hit trying to send a signal that would save all of us. The debt runs the other direction." The cephalopod's tentacles curled and uncurled. He looked at Andric for a long time with those segmented pupils, and then the chromatophore pattern changed. Something warmer. Something that the briefing documents did not have a direct translation for, because it occupied a register of cephalopod emotional expression that the xenolinguists were still mapping. Yenai, standing behind Andric, said quietly, "That pattern is flock bond. We learned it from the V3. His species doesn't have an equivalent, so he's borrowing it." Andric looked at Torrenvek. "Flock bond. The closest concept in your language," Torrenvek said, "is family that is chosen rather than born." The corridor was quiet. Outside, the last sounds of the assault's aftermath, the hiss of cooling metal, the distant clicks of Drayen communication across the valley, faded into the pre-dawn silence. Andric sat down beside Torrenvek. Yenai sat on the other side. They did not speak for a while. They did not need to. At 4:18, the short-channel communicator on Yenai's belt chirped. She answered it. Noma's voice, flat and controlled. "Andric, Yenai, command post. Now." They went. Noma was standing over the tactical display, a battered holographic projector that Andric had repaired twice, and that Yenai had kept supplied with power cells, studying a formation map that showed the mesa, the valley, and the Drayen positions as best their remaining sensors could estimate. "The next assault will be the last one," Noma said. "Not ours, theirs." "How do you know?" "Because they sent 3 vectors tonight instead of 1, and they still didn't take the compound. That means they've committed their reserves. A species that operates on systematic tactical rotation doesn't escalate to 3 vectors unless the next step is all of them at once." "When?" "Tomorrow night, maybe the night after. They'll rest, resupply, and hit us with everything." "Silence." "Can we hold?" Yenai asked. Noma looked at her. The weariness in her face was absolute, the kind that lived under the skin, in the marrow, in the place where willpower originated and from which it was slowly, steadily being drained. But her eyes were clear, and her voice was steady, and when she answered, it was with the precision of someone who had already done the calculation and was simply reporting the result. "No, not the full perimeter. We can hold 2 walls, maybe 3, not 4. The western section that breached tonight is compromised even with Andric's patch. A full-force assault from 4 vectors will find the gaps. So we fall back to the inner compound. The inner compound is 3 rooms and a corridor with no structural reinforcement. We'd last an hour." More silence. "There's another option," Andric said. They looked at him. The communications array. Torrenvek was trying to punch a signal through the Drayen jamming net when he got hit. He couldn't, because the Drayen are running broadband suppression across the entire plateau. But broadband suppression has a power cost. They're running it from a generator, and that generator has to be within effective range of the plateau or the signal degrades. "We know where the generator is," Noma said. "Keswick spotted it on her last reconnaissance flight. It's 600 meters south-southeast in a depression behind the secondary ridgeline. Guarded." "How guarded?" 20 to 30 Drayen. "A defensive perimeter, sensor arrays, probably crew-served weapons covering the approaches." "And if someone knocks it out?" Noma's expression shifted. It was a subtle thing, a tightening around the eyes, a setting of the jaw that Andric had seen before, always in the moment, when a commander realized that the person in front of them was not asking a tactical question, but volunteering for something. If someone knocks out the generator, the jamming field drops. We get maybe 10 to 15 minutes before they bring a backup online or reroute power. In that window, if the communications array is functional, we can punch a distress signal to the Combine relay at Sector Anchor 7. Response time from the nearest patrol is estimated at 90 minutes. 90 minutes is a long time. It is, but it's 90 minutes with the possibility of relief versus a guaranteed overrun within 48 hours. Those aren't equivalent options. The array, Yen, I said, is it functional? It was when Torenvek got hit. Noma looked at Andric. You inspected it after. What's your assessment? Damaged. The main transmitter coil took secondary shrapnel from the conduit breach. I can fix it, but it needs hands-on time. Maybe 2 hours. You have until tomorrow night. I'll have it ready by morning. Noma nodded. Then the question is the generator. I'll go. The words came out without preamble, without justification, without the elaborate tactical reasoning that Andric knew Noma would expect. They came out because they were true. He was the Sapper. He had the demolition kit. He knew how to move through terrain, how to read a defensive perimeter, how to place charges for maximum structural disruption on a target he had never seen before based on first principles and the understanding of how things were built, and therefore how they came apart. Noma studied him. It's 600 meters across open terrain, at night, past Drayen patrols. I've been working outside the wall for 9 days. I know the ground. You know the ground inside our sensor range. Past 200 meters, you're in the dark. I'm an engineer, Sergeant. I work in the dark half the time anyway. Noma almost smiled. It was the closest thing to a smile he had seen on her face in 9 days, and it lasted less than a second, and it was real. You don't go alone. I'm the only Sapper. You're the only Sapper, but you're not the only person in this outpost who can walk 600 meters in the dark. Yenai goes with you. She knows the supply manifest, which means she knows what the Drayen are carrying for generator components. She can identify the critical systems faster than you can. Yenai nodded. Once, clean. No argument, no hesitation. She had already inventoried the risk and decided the return was worth it. Andric looked at her. You're a logistics specialist who inventoried your demolition kit on day 1 and knows the blast radius of every charge you're carrying. You need someone to watch your back and count your resources while you work. That's logistics. He could not argue with the logic. He had stopped trying to argue with Yenai's logic around day 4. They spent the remaining hours before dawn in preparation. Andric repaired the communications array, working by headlamp in the relay room with no floor, tracing the shrapnel damage through the transmitter coil, and replacing the ruptured segments with wire he stripped from the secondary systems. It was delicate work. The coil operated at frequencies that required precise calibration, and the replacement wire was not rated for the same load, but he compensated with tighter winding and a capacitor he fabricated from a power cell casing. And when he ran the diagnostic at 6:30, the array tested functional. Not optimal, functional. There was a difference, and the difference was the space where engineers lived. Torenvek came to the relay room while Andric was calibrating the frequency harmonics. The cephalopod moved slowly, his tentacles gripping the doorframe for support, his wound sealed but clearly still painful. He watched Andric work on the array that he himself had been trying to operate when the shrapnel hit him, and his chromatophores cycled through a slow, complex pattern that Andric now recognized as the cephalopod expression for something being completed that had been left unfinished. The harmonic profile is wrong, Torenvek said. The replacement wire has a different conductivity index. Your signal will drift. Andric looked at him. How much drift? Enough to miss the relay's reception window. Let me. One tentacle extended, thin and precise, and adjusted the calibration dial by a fraction that Andric's fingers were too thick to achieve. The diagnostic readings shifted. Locked. Better, Andric asked. Now it will find the relay. The first time. They looked at each other, the human engineer and the cephalopod communications officer, neither of them whole, neither of them in the role they had been trained for, both of them doing what needed doing because That was what the 11 people on this mesa had become. Not a garrison, something else. Yenai prepped the sortie kit. 2 demolition charges, a shaped breacher, a small-arm sidearm for each of them, water, a medical pouch. She weighed the kit at 4.6 kilograms and cut it to 4.2 by removing the backup sidearm magazine and replacing it with a smaller caliber alternative that weighed less and would work at the ranges they expected. "You shaved 400 grams, Andric said. 400 grams is the difference between sprinting and jogging on the return. If we're being chased, I want to sprint." At 2100, they went over the wall. The night was clear and cold, the mesa air thin enough that their breath showed in faint plumes that dissolved into the dark. Andric moved first, dropping from the wall's outer face using a rope he had anchored to a structural bolt, and Yenai followed 3 seconds later with the same controlled descent. They hit the ground and moved south-southeast, keeping low, using the terrain features that Andric had memorized from 9 days of studying the ground through the observation ports. They did not speak. They communicated through touch. A hand on the shoulder meant stop, 2 taps meant move, a squeeze meant threat. This was not a system they had trained on. It was a system they had developed over 9 days of working together in confined spaces where sound carried, and the wrong word at the wrong moment could draw fire. 400 meters out, they hit the first Drayen patrol. 2 soldiers, moving along a ridgeline path in the steady, 4-armed gait that covered ground with deceptive speed. Andric and Yenai pressed flat against the volcanic rock and waited. The Drayen passed within 8 meters. Their chitin made a soft clicking sound as the plates shifted with each step, and their breathing was audible, a wheezing, multi-chambered inhalation that sounded mechanical. They waited until the patrol was 30 meters past, then moved. At 470 meters, they found the outer sensor line. Yenai spotted it first, a faint infrared pulse from a sensor pylon half buried in a rock crevice. She tapped Andric's shoulder twice and pointed. He studied the pylon for 15 seconds, tracing its power conduit with his eyes, reading the broadcast angle from the emitter's orientation. 45-degree cone, he murmured. Dead zone runs along the rock face for about 3 meters. I see it. They threaded through. 3 meters of clearance, bellies against volcanic stone that was cold enough to leach the heat through their fatigues. On the other side, they moved faster. The inner perimeter would be tighter, but the sensor density would be lower. Drayen field doctrine, concentrated detection assets on the outer ring, and relied on visual patrols for the inner zone. At 550 meters, they reached the secondary ridgeline. Andric crawled to the crest and looked down into the depression below. The generator was there. A Drayen field unit, a squat, cylindrical structure humming with the bass vibration of a high-output power system. It sat in a shallow excavation surrounded by a perimeter of sensor pylons and defensive positions. Andric counted the guards, 22, arranged in overlapping arcs, their 4-armed silhouettes visible against the faint glow of the generator's status indicators. He studied the layout for 3 minutes. Then he backed down from the crest and drew the positions in the dirt for Yenai, using his finger and the headlamp on its lowest setting. She studied the diagram. The generator's cooling system is on the south face. Those vents are the critical vulnerability. If you place a charge inside the primary vent, the thermal feedback destroys the core without needing to breach the casing. How do you know the cooling system is on the south face? Because Drayen field generators are standardized across their military. I read the Combine intelligence brief on Drayen field equipment on the transport ship. Page 47. The cooling vents are always oriented away from the primary deployment axis to prevent exhaust interference with sensor equipment. Andric looked at her. You read page 47 of a Combine intelligence brief. I read every page. It was a long transport. He placed the charges. One in the primary cooling vent. He crawled the last 40 meters on his belly, moving between the sensor pylons using the dead zones that Yenai had calculated from the pylon spacing and the broadcast angle of Drayen sensor technology. The second charge went on the power coupling that connected the generator to the jamming array's distribution node. Yenai stayed on the ridgeline, tracking guard movements and feeding him timing windows through the short-channel communicator pressed against her jaw, her voice barely above a breath. Window in 8 seconds, move to the coupling, stop at the debris pile. 4 seconds after that, the South Patrol rounds the generator, and you have 12 seconds of dead angle. He moved, he placed, he primed. They retreated to 200 meters, and Andric triggered the detonation. The generator died in a bloom of blue-white light that lit the depression like a flare, and sent a shockwave rolling across the mesa that Andric felt through his knees. The jamming field collapsed, he knew it instantly, because the dead static on the short channel cleared and he could hear, for the first time in 9 days, the faint background chatter of Combine communication frequencies that had been there all along, smothered by the Drayen's broadband suppression. "Noma," he said, "the field is down. Send the signal." Noma's voice came back in 2 seconds and the calm in it was absolute. "Array is transmitting. Signal confirmed on Sector Anchor 7 relay. Response inbound." They ran. The Drayen knew. The generator's destruction was not subtle, and the guards who survived were already fanning out, clicking their percussive alarms into the night. Andric and Yenai ran nor-northwest, toward the mesa, toward the wall, across 600 meters of volcanic rock that was no longer dark because the Drayen had lit flares along the ridgeline, and the whole basin was awash in harsh white chemical light. They ran, and Andric felt something he had not felt in 9 days, time moving forward instead of in a circle. The signal was out. Help was coming. The math had changed. A kinetic round cracked past his head. Then another. Yenai grabbed his arm and pulled him left, behind a rock formation, and they crouched there for 10 seconds while a Drayen fire team swept the ground where they had been. He could hear the clicking of their chitin, the wheeze of their breathing, the rapid-fire percussive commands of a squad leader coordinating pursuit. 200 meters, Yenai said. She was breathing hard, but her voice was level. "The wall is 200 meters. They broke cover and sprinted. A kinetic round struck the ground a meter to Andric's right and sent rock fragments stinging across his calf. Another snapped past Yenai's shoulder close enough that she flinched, a small, involuntary jerk that lasted a fraction of a second before her stride recovered. They ran the way people ran when running was not a choice but an engineering problem. Shortest path, maximum speed, minimum exposure. The wall appeared out of the dark, ugly and patchwork and standing, and Noma's voice came from the firing step above. Come on, move." Andric boosted Yenai up. She caught the rope and hauled herself over. Andric followed, his fingers finding the hull plating, the calcium compound, the composite decking panels that had been a floor 4 hours ago, and he pulled himself over the parapet and dropped to the inner ground and lay there, chest heaving, staring at the stars. "Signal confirmed," Noma said above him. "Combine patrol estimated 93 minutes out." 93 minutes. The Drayen hit them at 22:38, everything they had, all 4 vectors. The western wall buckled. The eastern wall held. The southeast section, Andric's patchwork, Yenai's panels held and held and held. Andric fought from the wall with a kinetic rifle and his sidearm, and at one point, a length of structural beam that he swung at a Drayen who had made it over the parapet before anyone could shoot. He was not a soldier. He was an engineer who was standing where he was needed, doing the next thing that needed doing, the way he had done everything for 9 days. Beside him on the wall, Hodgen fired with the steady rhythm of a man who had stopped being afraid somewhere around day 6 and had replaced the fear with something quieter and harder. Below in the compound, Torenvek sat at the communications console with his chromatophores blazing, monitoring the relay frequency and confirming every 60 seconds that the signal was still broadcasting, that help was still coming, that the math still held. At one point during the fighting, Keswick launched. Her damaged wing snapped open, and she rose from the compound on a steep, ugly climb that the other V3 would have called reckless, and she dropped her last 2 flares over the western breach, illuminating the Drayen assault force in a wash of white light that gave Noma's gunners clear targets for 8 critical seconds. She landed hard, the wing folded wrong. Andric was there before she hit the ground, catching her, his engineer's hands bracing the damaged membrane the way they would brace a fractured structural beam, firm, careful, distributing load. "I told you not to fly," he said. "And I told you that if the wall fell, I was going up." "The wall didn't fall." "Close enough." He carried her to the medical station. He set her down gently. She made the flock bond sound again, and this time Andric understood it without the translator. The Combine patrol arrived at 11. 3 corvettes dropped out of high orbit in a triangular formation that lit the mesa in blue-white engine wash, and the Drayen, who had been pressing the western breach with everything they had left, looked up and saw what was coming and began to pull back. The corvettes did not fire immediately. They held station, their weapons hot, their running lights blazing in the pre-dawn dark, and they waited for the Drayen to make the calculation that every tactical species eventually made: the cost of continuing versus the cost of withdrawing. The Drayen withdrew. It took 11 minutes. 11 minutes of the corvettes holding, their weapons tracking, their presence altering the equation. And then the valley was empty, and the mesa was quiet, and the war at Caldera 9 was over. Andric sat on the wall. His wall. The ugly, patchwork, functional wall that had held for 9 days against a force that outnumbered them 30-1, because an engineer had looked at what existed and seen what it could become. Yenai sat beside him. She handed him a ration bar. He ate it. Below in the compound, Torinvek had pulled himself to the observation port and was watching the corvettes with his segmented pupils wide and his chromatophores cycling through the flock bond pattern. Keswick sat beside him, her damaged wing carefully folded, her amber eyes reflecting the corvette's lights. Noma stood at the command post, talking to the patrol commander on a communications channel that worked for the first time in 9 days, her voice calm and precise, and giving a situation report that would take 4 hours to deliver properly, and that she was compressing into 40 minutes because that was what efficiency looked like. Hodgen had set his rifle down for the first time in 3 days and was flexing his bandaged forearm, testing the range of motion with the same careful patience he had once used for irrigation valves on Mars Colony 7. 11 people. Andric looked at them. He knew their names. He knew their injuries, their skills, their weight in the supply manifest. He knew which ones could fly and which ones could fight and which ones could do the mathematics of survival in their heads. He knew which ones made the flock bond sound and which ones cycled colors when they were grateful and which ones almost smiled. They were not his squad. They were not his species. They were not his family in any biological sense that the word covered. But a sapper knew that the strongest structures were not the ones built from the best materials. They were the ones built from whatever was available, by hands that understood what mattered, bonded together under pressure, until the seams held and the wall stood, and the people inside it were still alive in the morning. Yenai leaned against his shoulder. Not romance, not even comfort exactly, structural support. The way a brace leaned against a wall to keep it standing when it could not stand on its own. "You need sleep," she said. "Yeah." "You're not going to sleep, are you?" "Not yet." She stayed. They watched the dawn come up over the valley, amber and gold and clean, and the light hit the wall and lit the patchwork surfaces in warm color, and for a moment it almost looked beautiful. Almost. It was an engineer's wall, and engineers did not build for beautiful. They built for standing, and it stood. The historian's tentacles had stopped moving. She sat across the table from Andric, her data tablet forgotten, her chromatophores cycling through a pattern. He recognized the same one Torenvek had shown him in the corridor of a stripped relay room on a mesa that was 7 months and 3 star systems behind them now. "The official record," she said, "classifies your action as a technical contribution to a defensive engagement." It was. The Combine Commendation Board has recommended the Valor Citation for the 11 survivors. The language references extraordinary defensive performance under extreme numerical disadvantage. Andric said nothing. "Is that how you would describe it?" the historian asked. "Extraordinary defensive performance." He looked at his hands again, the scars on his knuckles, the calluses on his fingertips, the hands of a man who had spent his career finding the broken thing and making it hold. "I built a wall," he said. "Other people helped me build it. Some of those people had tentacles, some of them had wings. None of them had any reason to trust a human combat engineer from a species they barely knew, except that the wall needed building and I was the one who knew how. And that was enough. It was what we had." The historian looked at him for a long time. Then her chromatophores settled into the flock-bond pattern, steady, warm, unmistakable. "Specialist Andric," she said, "what happened to the wall?" He was quiet for a moment. "The Combine sent a construction team after the relief. Proper engineers, proper materials, proper everything. They tore down my wall and built a real one. Rated, certified, regulation compliant. It's beautiful." "Does it bother you?" "No, the wall did what it needed to do. It stood when it needed to stand. What happens to it after doesn't change what it was." He stood up. The interview was over. "One more question," the historian said. He waited. "Do you still see them, the 11? Andric thought about Yenai's hands passing him tools before he asked. About Keswick's flock bond clicking in the dark. About Torenvek's tentacle adjusting a calibration dial that human fingers were too thick to reach. About Noma's almost smile. About Hodgen testing the range of motion in his healing arm with the patience of a man who knew that some repairs took time. "Every week," he said, "Yenai runs the logistics. She sends a schedule." He walked out, the door closed behind him. The historian sat in the quiet room and looked at the data tablet she had not touched for the last 40 minutes, and the chromatophore pattern on her skin held steady in the warm, unmistakable register that her species reserved for something they did not have their own word for, and so had borrowed one from the V3, who had borrowed it from a human engineer on a mesa at the edge of known space. The word in every language that carried it meant the same thing. Family chosen held.